In the grand court of Magadha, a humble scholar stood before the mighty king Dhana Nanda. His name was Chanakya. He came not for glory or gold, but with a vision to strengthen India's borders and forge unity among the Janapadas, the ancient republics of the land. But instead of wisdom, what met him was arrogance. Dhana Nanda laughed at his appearance, mocked his attire, and, in a final act of humiliation, ordered his guards to drag Chanakya out by his braid knot. That moment changed everything. It was more than an insult. It was a spark that would ignite a revolution, bring down the mighty Nanda Dynasty, and give rise to one of the greatest empires in Indian history, the Mauryan Empire. This is not just a story of revenge. It's the story of how a single insult reshaped a civilization. This is the legend of Chanakya, the kingmaker, the strategist, the mind that built an empire. Long before empires rose at his command, before kings feared his name, there was a boy, born not into power, but into knowledge. This boy would grow to become one of the sharpest minds ancient India ever produced, Chanakya, also known as Vishnugupta or Kautilya. Chanakya was born around 350 BCE in or near Takshashila, one of the most advanced centers of learning in the ancient world. His birthplace remains debated. Some say modern-day Bihar, others claim the northwestern Indian subcontinent. But all agree on one thing. He was no ordinary child. Born into a Brahmin family, keepers of knowledge and tradition, Chanakya was raised not for conquest, but for wisdom. He mastered the Vedas, delved into philosophy, law, economics, and above all, politics. Where others saw power as ambition, he saw it as a science, a force to be understood, refined, and wielded. At Takshashila, he didn't just learn, he taught. His mind was already far ahead of his time, warning of how kingdoms fall not by invasion, but by greed, misrule, and arrogance. And among all the rulers of his day, one symbolized that arrogance most clearly: the Nanda Dynasty of Magadha, one of the richest empires of the time, ruled by a king whose pride would become his undoing, Dhana Nanda. It was in this very court that fate brought Chanakya, and where history would change forever. But why did he come to Dhana Nanda? What pushed a scholar into the den of a tyrant? To understand that, we must look beyond India's borders, to the west, to a storm brewing across the horizon, a storm named Alexander the Great. Around 326 BCE, as Chanakya studied the cracks in India's political foundation, a storm arrived from the west. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror, crossed the Hindu Kush and entered the Indian subcontinent. For the fragmented Indian kingdoms, many of them weakened by internal strife, it was a moment of reckoning. Some chose to resist, others surrendered without a fight. But for Chanakya, this was a wake-up call. He saw what others did not. The problem wasn't Alexander. It was India itself, divided, disorganized, vulnerable. Kingdoms too busy squabbling to unite against a common enemy. And at the heart of this weakness, he believed, was Magadha, ruled by Dhana Nanda, whose arrogance had blinded him to the danger closing in. Chanakya realized that India didn't just need scholars. It needed a visionary, a leader, and most of all, a unified empire that could stand against threats like Alexander. This wasn't just a political mission anymore. It was a national one. And so he traveled to the court of Dhana Nanda, not with fear, but with a plan. To advise, to unite, and to warn. Strengthen the borders, unite the Janapadas, prepare for the coming tide. But instead of listening, Dhana Nanda laughed. And what he did next would set in motion the fall of an empire. That insult would be remembered for generations. Because that day, a teacher became a rebel. And soon, the world would meet the man who would carry Chanakya's vision, Chandragupta Maurya. Every great mind needs a force, And every empire begins with a spark. Chanakya had the plan, but he needed the right person to execute it. A warrior, a king in the making, a lion cub who could grow into a ruler feared across the land. That spark was Chandragupta Maurya. Legend says it happened by chance. While travelling through northern India, perhaps in a market, perhaps in a training field, Chanakya witnessed a young boy leading a group of children in mock battles, displaying command, intelligence, and fearlessness beyond his years. That boy was Chandragupta, orphaned, or exiled, or perhaps a prince of a fallen line. Accounts vary. But what they all agree on is this: he had the heart of a king. Chanakya saw in him not just courage but clarity, a leader, a vessel to carry out his grand vision. At Takshashila University, Chanakya gave Chandragupta more than military skill. He taught him the art of governance, war, diplomacy, and most of all, strategy. This was no ordinary education. It was the grooming of an emperor. A silent revolution was rising in the shadows of India. The stage was set. The boy had become a weapon. The strategist had his king. And the time had come to strike at Magadha. By the late 320s BCE, Alexander the Great had retreated from India. His brief but disruptive invasion had left behind political chaos and power vacuums across the northwest. But in the heart of India, one kingdom still stood unchallenged, Magadha, under the iron grip of Dhana Nanda. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a revolution had begun. Chanakya and Chandragupta were no longer just plotting, they were acting. They built alliances with smaller kingdoms, tribal leaders, and disillusioned soldiers. They formed a guerrilla force, not yet an army, but something more dangerous, a cause. Their first attempt to take Magadha, around 323 BCE, ended in failure. Underestimating the might of the Nanda army, they were forced to retreat. But Chanakya saw this loss not as defeat, but as a lesson. Over the next few years, Chanakya employed his deadliest weapon, strategy. He infiltrated Magadha's administration through spies, sowed dissent, and spread rumours that weakened the king's grip. Meanwhile, Chandragupta grew into a seasoned commander, leading successful campaigns across eastern and central India, unifying territories under their cause. And then, around 321 BCE, the final assault on Pataliputra, the capital, was launched. Dhana Nanda, realizing too late that his empire was crumbling, was captured. His dynasty, one of the wealthiest in Indian history, was brought to an end. And on that day, a new empire rose, the Mauryan Empire, with Chandragupta Maurya, at just 20 years old, crowned as its first emperor. And beside this young emperor stood his teacher, his strategist, his mentor, Chanakya. The man who had vowed to untie his hair only after avenging the insult, finally did so. As Chandragupta ruled from the throne, Chanakya ruled from the mind. He became the royal advisor, the architect of policy, economy, intelligence, taxation, and military reforms. His greatest work, the Arthashastra, written around 300 BCE, became one of the world's earliest and most comprehensive texts on governance, espionage, war, justice, economics, and ethics. A guide not just for kings, but for empires. As Prime Minister, Chanakya helped shape the Mauryan Empire into a well-oiled machine. Roads were built, taxes streamlined, corruption punished, and justice enforced, not just with law but with logic. He believed rulers must be like fire, dangerous but necessary, and always under control. But Chanakya was no idealist. He believed in results. If peace required war or deception or sacrifice, so be it. To him, ethics and realism walked side by side. Under his vision, the Mauryan Empire became the largest and most powerful India had ever seen, stretching from the Himalayas to the Deccan, from present-day Afghanistan to Bengal. But what makes Chanakya's story truly timeless isn't just what he built, it's what he taught. That knowledge, if used wisely, is more powerful than any sword. And that one determined mind can shape the fate of an entire civilization. All legends must come to an end, but the end of Chanakya, India's sharpest mind, the kingmaker of empires, remains one of history's quiet mysteries. Historians disagree on how Chanakya's life ended. Some say he retired to the forest and lived as a recluse, following the ancient path of Vanaprastha, a sage's retreat from worldly life. Others say he chose voluntary starvation, a respected act in some traditions, after ensuring the empire was stable. Chanakya left quietly, just as he had come. No throne, no monuments, just wisdom etched in scrolls, and the echoes of an empire. Centuries have passed. Dynasties have risen and fallen. Yet Chanakya's name still echoes, in classrooms, in parliaments, in every discussion of statecraft and strategy. Long before Machiavelli's The Prince, Chanakya had already written about realpolitik, governing through pragmatism, not idealism. He emphasized morality where possible, but survival above all. Chanakya was more than a minister, more than a strategist, more than a philosopher. He was a man who proved that a sharp mind can be more powerful than a sharp sword, a man who rose from insult to immortality. This was the story of Chanakya, the mind that built an empire. Until next time, keep the fire of history burning. Eras fade, but stories endure.